Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ivany. Yes, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Father Robert Sirico, President of the Acton Institute. I should just take a moment to say that as I explore the thought of John Paul II, and I've shared my enthusiasm with different people at the university and the community, two members of the community, George Strake and Wiley Mossy, who's here this evening, I was chatting with them about the thought of John Paul II, and they both mentioned Father Sirico as a person that they have come to know and was impressed the way he had brought the papal social teaching to bear on contemporary issues. That is the goal of having a forum where we can look at the thought of John Paul II and see the marvelous things he's done to engage modern culture and modern events. So I did look into having Father come down to visit. He has visited campus before, and I think it's an honor for us to have him tonight. I would also, though, like to introduce Chris Morin. Are you here? Would you stand up? Chris is the co-founder with the of the Acton Institute with Father Sirico. He's visiting with us as well. Father Sirico has done some great work, particularly with the encyclical Centesimus Annus. He has given lectures and workshops at the Vatican on this. That does seem like carrying coals to Newcastle, but he's done it. He's going back to Rome this week. And if you look at the work of the Acton Institute, I think you'll see it's a great ecumenical venture bringing together men and women of all faiths to talk about important issues using both faith and reason. So it is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Father Sirico. Please welcome him with me.
Thank you, Dr. Hittinger, and thank you very much for your attendance this evening. It is a great honor to give this inaugural lecture here at the John Paul II Forum. There's so much about this Pope and his writings that apply to so many areas of life that I feel what I'm about to present is just a little piece of it. I have some prepared remarks, and I'm editing this paper as I speak, so that you won't have to endure all 36 pages of it, but I will make the document with all the critical apparatus available if it's of interest to you, if you just can't wait to get more of it. And I'll try to keep that under an hour and then invite some discussion. The moral test of any social or governmental policy is whether it is consistent with a rigorous concern for the life, the liberty, and the dignity of the human person, a right which each person has by virtue of his creation as the Imago Dei. Along with that dignity, God gives to each of us a rightful expectation that our liberties be respected and that justice be pursued on our behalf so that we may work for our own personal and familial fulfillment and as a means of achieving the common good as well as our eternal redemption. It is the goal of Catholic social teaching, especially under the pontificate of John Paul the Great, to articulate this moral vision of the free and virtuous society. In his encyclicals touching on economic systems, the late Pope has made remarkable contributions to religious thought concerning public policy and free economic systems. In what follows, I will not attempt to present the fullness of this very complex, subtle, and exhaustive thought on these matters, but rather I intend to provide a brief overview of a specific and especially notable dimension of the Pope's social teaching where he develops Catholic social teaching, namely its intersection with the tradition of what might be called in a European sense a classically liberal economic idea. I will elaborate on the implications of this liberal tradition rightly understood for the social order and draw some connections between papal social teaching and market economics generally, which will have a contemporary flavor to it. My commentary will not and cannot be restricted to economic subjects, simply because the thinking of John Paul II on economics impacts a whole range of human problems linked with the issue and rooted in the issue of the dignity of the human person. So I start with economic systems. I think it would be an error to characterize the thought of the late Pope by exclusive reference to a specific system of economic ideology or thought, and economics that we observe in the world today. Instead, what I think the Pope called upon was for a wholly different approach that rises above the materialism of Western capitalism and the bureaucratization of European welfare states, the mercantilist tendencies of Latin American economics, much less the Marxist collectivism of Eastern Europe. It would also be incorrect to associate the Pope's thought with calls for a third way between laissez-faire and state planning. Rather, the Pope writes, "The Church has no models to present. Models that are real and truly effective can only arise within the framework of different historical situations, through the efforts of all those who responsibly confront concrete problems in all their social, economic, political, and cultural aspects as these interact with each other." Nonetheless, it remains true that John Paul's major contributions to social thought were inspired by the recognition of the profound failures of socialism in 1989, the key social political doctrine of much of the 20th century, which collapsed into rubble with the fall of the Soviet Union and its allies and its satellites in Eastern Europe. The fundamental error of socialism, I'm quoting John Paul now, is anthropological in nature. He goes on, "Socialism considers the individual person simply as an element, a molecule within the social organism, so that the good of the individual is completely subordinated to the functioning of the social economic mechanism," close quote. John Paul rightly rejected the politically charged term capitalism. The phrase simply means too much to too many things, to too many people, as Rocco Buttiglione, who is an advisor to the Holy Father, has pointed out in his book, The Free Economy and the Free Man. Instead, and with some reluctance, he embraces the phrase free economy and business economy rather than capitalism. He says the modern business economy has positive aspects. Its basis is human freedom exercised in the economic field, just as it is exercised in other fields. Again, he says, it would appear that on the level of individual nations and of international relations, the free market is the most efficient instrument for utilizing resources and effectively responding to needs, close quote. Many of these quotes are taken from Centesimus Annus, and as I mentioned, the specific references will be made available to you. Within the free market economy, however, a juridical setting is needed in order to protect the requisite institutions of property, exchange, entrepreneurship, and the rule of law. What the Pope is advocating here is not a capitalist ideology. Secular attempts to disregard these essential institutions, especially during the past century, possibly the most secular time in many centuries, have resulted in material deprivation and human impoverishment. It is not only through sentiment, but also through careful analysis that political, sociological, and economic insights can be gained and applied to real-world situations. To be sure, religious and spiritual concerns were primary to John Paul's thinking and his analysis. At the same time, the Pope thought that we disregard the insights of economic science and history only at our peril. The good intentions of political ideas must always be checked by a reasonable understanding of the results of ideas. I move now to exchange, association, and enterprise. The aim of any economic policy should be to expand the production and availability of goods and services, to increase the quality of life for individuals and communities, and to do so in a manner consistent with the rights and the dignity of individuals and the overall common good. These goals are not incongruous. Respect for human liberty and the increase in the quality of life are both features of the exchange economy. In this form of economy, people are left free to improve their lot through cooperative efforts. Economic theory teaches that the institution of economic exchange is the primary means of increasing overall prosperity. When an economic exchange takes place, each person trades something subjectively regarded as having value, having a lower value, for something subjectively regarded as having a higher value. That's why it's free exchange. If two people voluntarily trade eggs and milk, for example, each is made better off than before, or else the trade would never have occurred. If everyone in the economy is free to perform these types of exchanges and to plan for exchanges in the future, a vast network of human cooperation arises from what is called a market. It's more of a process than a place. To have a market requires free persons who come to a meeting of the minds. The market is a consistently changing and developing process because people's values are constantly changing, as does the availability of resources. The introduction of money into this exchange process does not change the essential cooperative nature of the process. Money makes it possible for the parties in the economy to have a common unit of value, further facilitating the opportunities for trade as well as efficiency. In a money economy, the unit of exchange becomes the common measure by which people can communicate with each other about their respective talents and needs. Money's significance as the most economically desirable commodity is precisely in its use as a means of exchange. The creation of a network of human cooperation that permits rising prosperity is impossible to achieve without economic exchange. Even with exchange, third-party interruption in the market puts barriers between cooperation that can in fact limit its abilities to make it possible for the improvement of the human condition. As much as possible, then, freedom and what the Pope calls the right of association should be permitted so that people can seek out others who desire to exchange in voluntary cooperation. Through this kind of contact, the market process allows people the opportunity to realize material fulfillment. And by finding ways to agree on exchange, the market process increases contact and understanding between people and therefore a sense of community, even internationally. The more diverse the cultural values of the people, the more freedom of association through exchange becomes an essential means of bringing people together and making their well-being dependent on each other's talents and their willingness to trade. It is why the Pope took special mention of the political and economic institutions of the United States, where such freedoms are a primary element of the political culture and the driving force behind economic life, when he visited the United States, in particular in 1987. The market economy and its requisite institutions are not only highly desirable in the market for goods and services. In the labor sector, where people offer their talents to others in return for the payment of wages and salaries, free exchange and free association are also crucial components of a healthy community. All people are called to work for their own well-being as well as their families and society as a whole. As the Pope wrote, quote, "The Church's teaching has always expressed the strong and deep conviction that man's work concerns not only the economy, but also and especially personal values. The economic system itself and the production process benefit precisely when these personal values are fully respected. In the mind of St. Thomas, this is the principal reason in favor of private ownership of the means of production." Close quote. This work can take many forms, and its ultimate value is obtained when it is offered for the glory of God under His value system, regardless of remuneration. In a free economy, however, wages and salaries reflect the contribution of the individual worker that worker makes toward the community of workers in the business firm and the overall wealth of society. The freedom of employees to change jobs and the freedom of employers to make unhampered and enforceable contracts with workers ensures that each individual can find opportunity for work. As a person, the Pope wrote, man is therefore the subject of work. As a person, he works, he performs various actions belonging to the work process. Independently of their objective content, these actions must all serve to realize his humanity, to fulfill the calling to be a person that is his by reason of his very humanity." Close quote. Market competition for labor works to make sure that workers are paid a price that corresponds to their talents and their contributions. A thriving exchange economy for labor requires more than a commitment to equality, for even in the most homogeneous society, people are radically different from one another, a reflection on the diversity of God's creation. No two members of a society will have identical interests and talents. An economic system should make it possible for everyone who so wishes to participate in the common task of building prosperity to do so. Fortunately, the cooperative nature of a market economy makes this possible so long as there are no unnecessary barriers to entering the existing particular market for goods and services and labor, or to exit from it. And yet the labor market can easily be discoordinated through ill-advised policies of making all wages and all salaries the same, labor equality or parity, through inhibiting the free movement of laborers from one firm to another, or through seeking equality of outcome rather than the equality of rules. The result of such policies is a displacement of human resources, a limiting of opportunities, a hampering of the contribution that the diversity of workers can offer, and a decline in the overall standard of living of the populace as a whole. Employees should be treated with the dignity and respect which their nature as human beings demands. This obligation should be considered binding because it grows out of Christ's commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves, as well as the principle of solidarity. In addition, the same gospel that would have workers treated with respect also binds employees to treat their employers with respect for their inherent dignity. In a free economy, the relationship between the two is characterized by both parties coming together on the terms in common agreement. Their contracts should be honest, and their commitments to each other should be kept. Proverbs says, "Wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it." The well-being of society depends on workers not to mislead employers, for workers have a special obligation to be conscious of the risks employers undertake in their role as entrepreneurs. An unfortunate feature of modern religious thought and economics is the characteristic lack of appreciation of this precise function, the entrepreneurial function. Because the world is not static and people's needs and values are constantly changing, an economic system requires some means of adjustment. It has to be dynamic in order to meet the needs that present themselves in the course of history. The person who invests him or herself and the resources that he or she owns is choosing to assist the economy keep up with changes and serve others in the process. The entrepreneur must constantly be aware of the needs of others, sometimes even before others have become conscious of those needs themselves, and apply those resources to see that they are met. He or she, the entrepreneur, must have an alertness and an innovativeness of mind. To be sure, entrepreneurs can never be certain that a particular investment or a project will ultimately work out. But he takes a risk and even chooses to meet a payroll before he is certain of what the future holds. Sometimes his assessment of the future turns out well, and sometimes it does not. In either case, the entrepreneur's courage to face an uncertain future is a commendable virtue and a worthy calling. It is a triumphant contribution, a very distinct contribution of John Paul the Great's thought to have introduced this notion of the right of economic initiative into the theological vocabulary. It should be noted, the Pope wrote, that in today's world, among other rights, the right of economic initiative is often suppressed. Yet it is a right which is important not only for the individual, but for the common good. Experience shows us that the denial of this right, or its limitation in the name of an alleged equality of everyone in society, diminishes or in practice absolutely destroys the spirit of initiative, that is to say, the creative subjectivity of the citizen. As a consequence, there arises not so much a true equality, but a leveling down, close quote. When entrepreneurs are successful, they advance the cause of growing prosperity by providing goods and services that people need and determine that they want. They discover new ways of understanding old tasks. They rediscover old ways to undertake new tasks. They find a more efficient way of producing things, which is another way of saying that they demonstrate to us ways that God's resources can be put to use more prudently, more efficiently, more wisely. By providing jobs, moreover, they do this in a way that is respectful of human dignity. The Pope writes, man's principal resource is man himself. Quote, his intelligence enables him to discover the earth's productive potential and the many different ways in which human needs can be satisfied. It is his disciplined work in close collaboration with others that makes possible the creation of ever more extensive working communities which can be relied upon to transform man's natural and human environments, close quote. Planned economies that have lacked an appreciation for the economic innovator and denied the innovator a chance to act out his own vocation have stagnated simply because they have failed to keep up with the changes in public values and create new technologies. Market economies that provide opportunities and rewards for entrepreneurs, as well as cultures that afford them appreciation and respect, generate prosperity for everyone. The entrepreneurial function is often associated with high profits. Yet in the market, the only way that high profits can come about is when a seller provides products or services at fair prices that the public will willingly purchase. The Pope writes, when a firm makes a profit, this means that productive factors have been properly employed and corresponding human needs have been duly satisfied, close quote. That in no way suggests that the products the public chooses are the best ones, or the most morally suitable ones, or the ones that virtue would recommend. That is the task of those who form the moral conscience, to help people be discerning in what they purchase and in what they invest in, not economic institutions as such, to direct consumer tastes toward good ends. It is only to say that entrepreneurs successfully profit to the extent that they serve the subjective desires of the public, but this is not to say that the whole of the culture should be dictated by such economic actors. The entrepreneur is the most obvious example of the person who uses his creative talents given to him by the Creator for the good of others. Others in the market-based division of labor should also exercise the virtue of enterprise and creativity in as many ways as is possible and appropriate to them. Workers can discover better ways to accomplish tasks, and owners and employers are wise to be open to their suggestions. The freedom to change jobs and locations also provides institutional assurance that those with new ideas and new talents can discover in order to use the best ways to place them at the service of others. The freedom of enterprise is the best institutional setting for the lessons of the parable of the talents to be realized. In Matthew's Gospel, we read them. In that parable, Christ tells the story of three men, as you know, who are given unequal talents. Two men invest their talents and double their value. They receive praise and added trust and responsibility. The third buries his talent and is scorned as a result. The lesson points to a personal development as a spiritual virtue, and its economic effect is growing wealth, which is praiseworthy as well. But if I may digress from the text itself, I think it is the fear of the unsuccessful one who is given those talents and his misapprehension of the nature of the master that is the damnable part of that wicked servant, called so by the Lord himself in the gospel. Now I turn to ownership and stewardship. The central aim of economic policy, increasing the quality of life for individuals in the community in a manner consistent with human dignity, is impossible unless the economy rests on a foundation of privately owned property, which Leo XIII is in his encyclical Rerum Novarum called sacred. The earth, the Pope writes, by reason of its fruitfulness and its capacity to satisfy human needs, is God's first gift for the sustenance of human life. But the earth does not yield its fruits without a particular human response to God's gift. That is to say, without work. It is through work that we, using our intelligence and exercising our freedom, succeed in dominating the earth and making it a fitting home. Close quote. Property, in this view, should not become a source of conflict or struggle, but rather should be used to improve the human condition. The Pope said, "It is obvious that when we speak of opposition between labor and capital, we are not dealing only with abstract concepts or impersonal forces operating in economic production. Behind both concepts," he says, there are people, living, actual people. On the one side are those who do the work without being the owners of the means of production, and on the other side of those who act as entrepreneurs and who own the means or represent the owner. Thus, the issue of ownership of property enters from the beginning into the whole of this difficult historical process, close quote. Many societies have experimented with the idea of collective ownership, but and I should note here that when I say collective ownership, I'm talking about ownership mandated by law, not communal, voluntary systems of ownership such as those of us who live in religious communities live within the midst of. So these experiments of collective ownership have gone on, but they have discovered that the entire concept is a misnomer. All property must be owned by someone or something. So when we speak of collective ownership, we're really only talking about ownership by the state or the government administered by bureaucrats. Not the least problem with this concept is that it concentrates power and influence too heavily in one sector of society. Privately held property, however, on the other hand, tends to diffuse power and influence society throughout through the competition that goes on. In the Church's teaching, John Paul wrote, "Ownership has never been understood in a way that could constitute grounds for social conflict in labor." Close quote. The incentive structure, too, is different under privately held versus collectively held property. When property is in private hands, it must be cared for and used to serve others. Within a market process for private property, resources will flow in the direction of the people who can care for it best and use it to serve others. That is, those who can be productive with it. On the other hand, publicly owned property can easily and very often falls into disrepair because no one in particular is responsible for its upkeep and its use. The proper distribution of private property generates controversy because there are no possible human circumstances under which it can be perfectly equal. Nor should that be the goal of a humane society. Rather, it should be our primary concern that those who own and acquire property have done so justly. Property should be owned by virtue of free contract and voluntarism, not through confiscation, force, fraud, or coercive means of redistribution. Only in the most extreme and urgent of circumstances does the Church Church's social teaching allow for such. If we can be certain that titles to property, whether those assets are in money, property, or businesses, are justly acquired, the demands of formal justice are therefore satisfied without reference to the equality of distribution of that property. The moral injunction against theft, common in most all religious systems, implies a moral injunction against violating the established barriers of private ownership and logically the moral legitimacy of private property ownership to begin with. The most bitter and even bloody struggles in world history have come about because of a failure of some, whether private criminals or public magistrates, to respect the biblical commandment against theft. A similar struggle ensues when society's essential resources are controlled exclusively by political means, which leads to tragedies of its own sort. To reiterate, social peace and cooperation are not advanced through struggle over resources, but through trade, through exchange. That requires that the boundaries of property be well defined and well respected. It is commonplace, even in market economies, for certain goods and services to be owned and controlled collectively, that is, by the state. Often, however, the efficient provision of these goods and services can be increased when they are owned by people who have a stronger stake in the use of those resources. I move now to prices and profits. Every society must have a guide for allocating the use of its resources because of the unlimited nature of human wants that always outpaces the scarce resources that are required to meet those needs. Even economies where most or all property is held in private hands must have a tool for making sure that resources are used in ways that a community finds most valuable. It is not automatically clear which of the many possibilities of resource are best. We must have some way of knowing whether water is best used for drinking, bathing, or irrigation, or if iron ore is best used for making cars or building tractors. The same is true for all social resources. Even the resource of time, which is also scarce, requires some tool for efficient allocation. The best guide for wise allocation of the network, the best guide for wise allocation is the network of prices which arise naturally from the buying and selling of acting individuals. Here the laws of economics come into play. When the price of a good is lower, it signals the abundance and people can buy more of it. When it is higher, it signals a relatively higher level of scarcity, and people must economize on their use of that commodity. Through the price system, which is constantly in flux, consumers know how much of a good they can purchase and use, and producers know how much of a good they can produce and sell. Prices serve as more than signals for consumption and production, however. They also allow us to consider the costs. They help us to determine whether a good or service is being wasted, therefore should not be put in production, or if it is highly desired, therefore its production should be increased. The idea of profit is simply the name that accounting and bookkeeping attaches to the condition of income outpacing costs. When a company is making a profit, it is given a signal that it is performing its tasks properly in the eyes of the public, that is, the consumers. But when it takes a loss, the price system is informing the managers and the owners that they need to turn to other pursuits so that the social resources are not wasted. The social obligation of the business does not stop here. Business must deal honestly, must keep contracts, must serve the human community in the broadest sense, must be attentive to the moral dimension of the investing process. Nonetheless, the signaling devices of profit and loss serve an irreplaceable economic function. The Pope forthrightly states, quote, "The Church acknowledges the legitimate role of profit as an indication that a business is functioning well. When a firm makes a profit, this means that the productive factors have been properly employed and corresponding human needs have been duly satisfied. He goes on to say, but profitability is not the only indicator of a firm's condition. Profit is a regulator of the life of a business, but it is not the only one. Other human and moral factors must also be considered, which in the long term are at least equally important for the life of the business. Close quote. We often hear about complaints about excessive profits, but let's look at that from an economic point of view. In terms of the function that they serve in a market economy, what they do is simply to signal other entrepreneurs that the public is demanding more of a particular good. If somebody's making an excessive, quote unquote, excessive profit, it signals other entrepreneurs that they'd better get into that market. When business people notice the high profits of others, new investors, new creators enter that market to meet that demand. It is precisely this inflow and outflow of investors and producers in various markets that makes high profits a possibility. But the competitive bidding for resources and public attention means no one can find himself in an automatically profitable position. This process also sets conditions for increasing efficient modes of production. When the price system is fixed, or when it is distorted through various third-party interventions, whether through price control or inflation or excessive regulation, then the production that it governs similarly becomes distorted. When the prices of goods are held at some level by the force of law, producers can no longer recover costs in that production, and shortages inevitably result. Economic reasoning suggests that when wages, which reflect the price of labor, are fixed at a high level, they shut out marginal workers from the division of society's essential tasks. When inflation makes the price system unreliable, which is a form of tampering with weights and measures condemned in Leviticus, it causes great and grave miscalculations, removes the reason to save and invest, or incites people to save or to invest in the wrong things. It hampers future growth and makes the cost of living eventually rise for everyone. And I might also add, I think this is a lot of what has been happening in recent months. We can talk about in the discussion section. Let me move now to charity and welfare, because the welfare of vulnerable members of society is at the core, at the heart of the Church's social teaching. And this should be of concern to any civilized society. Some members of society will always require the care of others, including the children and the aged. We have an absolute moral obligation that these people be watched over and cared for, and above all, to be loved. The major question for social policy is not whether such people should be cared for, but how they should be cared for in their capacities as parents and relatives, and who should be first responsible. Or should parents and relatives be relieved of that responsibility, thus creating a kind of intergenerational warfare through various schemes of social insurance, laws that hand over to bureaucrats the role of the primary caretaker. The best insurance of the well-being of the vulnerable is the intact family unit, because the family knows their needs best. The second option, giving responsibility away, has grave consequences for the family, for it tells those whom Christ commanded to love one another that they no longer have an obligation to be the first providers of those closest to them. The system of age-old insurance in no way relieves the obligation. The system of old age insurance in no way relieves the obligation to care for one's parents in their old age, but sets up incentives that are more likely to tempt people to forget their obligations. The Pope has heavily criticized the inhumane aspects of the welfare state, in the following sentences. And I might add that when this encyclical came out, Centesimus Annus in 1991, was among the most debated and shocking for some people sections of the encyclical. And I quote, "In recent years, the range of such intervention has vastly expanded to the point of creating a new type of state, the so-called welfare state. This has happened in some countries in order to respond better to many needs and demands by remedying forms of poverty and deprivation unworthy of the human person. However, excesses and abuses, especially in recent years, have provoked very harsh criticisms of the welfare state, dubbed the social assistance state. Malfunctions and defects in the social assistance state are the result of an inadequate understanding of the tasks proper to the state. Here again, the principle of subsidiarity must be respected. A community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions, but rather should support it in case of need and help to coordinate its activities with the activities of the rest of society, always with a view for the common good." Close quote. When the state becomes the primary caretaker of children, through well-intentioned laws designed to enhance welfare, it tragically reduces the responsibility of parents and the value of children to parents. A particular problem occurs when the state subsidizes behavior that should be discouraged if we want to retain strong families, when it in effect invites fathers out of the home. An example is out of wedlock births, which have dramatically increased everywhere that the state has chosen to give an excess of money to women in this position. When the state intervenes in this manner, it sends a signal to fathers that they're no longer really needed to stay in their role as husbands and fathers and caretakers. And this results in an increase in single parents, usually females. Also among the vulnerable in any society are the poor, whether in our own families or communities or in society at large. When this issue is usually discussed, the issue of inequality of wealth inevitably arises. But it's not an issue of the inequality of wealth that should concern us primarily, for inequality can also be reduced by making everyone equally poor. I really don't care about the inequality between Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. That's not the moral question. The issue of poverty itself and the human suffering that accompanies it is more foundationally the rights that are violated along with the denial of economic opportunity and the rights of the poor. The Pope says, quote, "The denial or the limitation of human rights, as for example, the right to religious freedom, the right to share in the building of society, the right of freedom to organize, to form unions, or to take initiatives in other economic matters, do these not impoverish the human person as much as, if not more than, the deprivation of material goods? And is the development which does not take into account the full affirmation of these rights really the development, is it really development on the human level?" Close quote. The best solution to growing poverty is a growing economy. It provides jobs, better pay, better working conditions, more economic opportunities, and a chance for everyone to achieve. A growing economy requires that a market economy be allowed to function with this discovery process that I talked about earlier. In thinking about ways to help the poor, we must consider the costs and the benefits of various strategies. Our sentiments do not put food into the mouths of the poor. If we turn to the government, particular dangers arise. Governmental policies can create impersonal forces with which the poor will be forced to deal, which can be demeaning. In addition, bureaucracies have a tendency to expand beyond their payrolls rather than their ability to serve others. They can take a greater and greater share of private wealth instead of staying within fiscal constraints. The benefits of aid to a specific group might be outweighed by the indirect and longer-term costs for the community as a whole. State bureaucracies have illustrated a lack of ability to fully understand the nature and the problem of poverty. The targeting of assistance within the context of bureaucracy tends toward imprecision, to put it mildly. Public agencies cannot make the necessary distinctions between legitimate need and illegitimate demands, and they tend to impose heavy burdens of debt on future generations, which I'm sorry to say many of you in this room are about to experience in your future. John Paul explained, quote, "By intervening directly and depriving society of its responsibilities, the social assistance state leads to a loss of human energies and an inordinate increase of public agencies, which are dominated more by bureaucratic ways of thinking than by concern for serving their clients, and which are accompanied by an enormous increase in spending. In fact, it would appear," he says, "that needs are best understood and satisfied by people who are closest to them and who act as neighbors to those in need. It should be added that certain kinds of demands often call for a response which is not simply material, but which is capable of perceiving the deeper human need." Close quote. Long-term poverty is more than a condition of lacking material goods. It is a condition that involves deeper and more structural problems that require personal attention. This kind of attention is best given by individuals, families, churches first, rather than the state being the resource of first resort. That is why the assertion of rights can sometimes become very problematic and foster a kind of division in society. The most charitable societies in the world have been the wealthiest, and the richest societies have also been the most free. When people have more disposable income, they can contribute more to charitable causes. Only a free economy can generate this kind of wealth, and it requires humane virtues, not selfishness, to give of oneself regardless of economic conditions. I'm going to skip the section that I have. I can hear a sigh of relief going up, on subsidiarity and solidarity, but if you get the paper, I hope you'll read it. Let me conclude by saying serious social and economic issues had confronted John Paul II during his pontificate, not the least of which was the demise of socialism in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, which became the immediate occasion for the writing of Centesimus Annus. And these have impacted his teaching, and I think will impact the future encyclical that we expect in April by Pope Benedict. These same issues that John Paul confronted are issues that confront us today. And these are issues that will continue to be widely discussed and debated in various political circles and in campaigns, in books, and in universities. Blessed John XXIII, in his encyclical Moderate Magistra, reminds us that Catholics can have different prudential opinions on these kinds of specific political and policy matters, but we must agree on the charity of our exchange. My comments on the morality and economics are offered with the purpose of directing our attention to issues concerning the role of government and public policy, which will inevitably arise. I do this first and foremost as a pastor, anxious to apply the Church's social teaching, in particular the insights of John Paul II, and apply that and create a dialogue between the tradition of economic thought as well as contemporary social problems. This discussion has highlighted the importance of free exchange, free association, enterprise, private property, the price system and profits, voluntary charity and welfare provision, and the limit of the role of the state, both in the Pope's thought and in the tradition of economic thinking generally. What I have done, I have attempted to do in both an ecumenical spirit, in the belief that the flourishing of these institutions is consistent with a rigorous concern for the life, liberty, and dignity of the human person, and is in harmony with the moral tradition of a truly Catholic civilization. Thank you very much.
I really enjoyed your paper. Thank you. I learned a lot from it. And I actually had a twofold question. It's more for clarification purposes. And there's that really fruitful concept that you mentioned in Centesimus Annus about a juridical framework for economic activity that John Paul II talks about, but didn't really clarify as much as I'd hoped. And I think that you did a really nice job unpacking it. I'd also recall you mentioning in a basic economic model, you talked about the exchange of eggs and milk, and that people will exchange something that is subjectively valuable to another for something that is subjectively valuable for themselves. And so my first part of the question, I'm trying not to meander too much here, is just simply, how do you imagine that juridical framework operating in a fashion that it's not excessively intervening in these sorts of exchanges, so that there's excessive regulation or influence of the parties involved in the exchange? And I realize that's a long question itself and kind of loaded, so I'll save the second part. But how do you imagine that juridical framework operating without being too much of that third party intervening that you warned against?
Well, I think we had a good idea in this country 200 and something years ago. And it would be very innovative if we kind of had a renaissance of that thinking, to my notion, because this is really very complementary to the principle of subsidiarity. So that if we have, remember that the American Constitution and the Founding Fathers begin with a very different point of departure, that the state exists to protect the rights of the citizenry, not to protect the rights of the state. And that the whole purpose of the Constitution was to delineate the limits of the power of the state, which is why you have all of this, and anyone who's read the Federalist Papers, all of this very delicate, calibrated balance of powers and diffusion of authority or power in society. And that the role of the courts was to define law, not make it. That's the role of another sector of society. And I think where we have gotten ourselves in trouble, and this is a very, I hate to use the phrase, but it's such an apt phrase, slippery slope. It's so attractive to go down this because the moment you begin by incentivizing people to vote for you because you can give them something, a lot of people are going to line up for that, and a lot of good people are going to line up for that. This is the whole phenomenon of lobbyists. The problem with lobbyists isn't the problem that somebody who has a business has a certain insight and lets legislators know about it. The problem with lobbyists is that the legislators have so much power that they can affect the companies involved. If you limit the scope of what the government can do, you limit the desirability of lobbyists to go to politicians and buy their way and their advantage over their competitors. So I think what we need is a return to the founding principles, which are, as I say, very much in accord. If we took the principle of subsidiarity seriously, I think we could go a long way to negotiating a lot of the left-right disagreements that exist right now, because these become more and more polarized. On the one hand, you have an excessive kind of radical libertarianism that doesn't really place a high stock in culture and in other restraining factors in society, or operates out of a capitalist ideology, which the Pope directly addresses in this, that doesn't place a high value on juridical systems. And on the other hand, you have the kind of collectivist, give away the store and all of this. I think what subsidiarity does is it takes people from a variety. Remember, it's a principle of prudence. And it doesn't say that the government can't intervene. It just says you can't substitute. You can help. You can't substitute for the other sectors, the non-governmental sectors of society. And you should remove yourself once the other sectors of society exist. So I think federalism, I think subsidiarity would go a very long way to delimit this, but it is so seductive to be able to say, if you vote for me, I'm going to bring home the bacon. And this is not a Democratic thing. This is a Republican thing. They're always, this is what I'm going to bring home. I'm going to bring home the money. So I hope. Let me also say that I was very disappointed, to be diplomatic about it, in the bishop's conference statement on the social teaching of the church about 2 years ago. They kind of sent out a statement in which they identified the core principles of Catholic social teaching, and they don't mention subsidiarity in it. This is nuts. This is absolute. See, now I'm not being diplomatic anymore. This is amnesia. We have forgotten our own tradition. And so we just need to go back to this, and we can have a very rich discussion that doesn't put us in one ideological basket if we just resurrected the principle of subsidiarity.
Hi, Father, maybe you can help me think through a dilemma that I've been thinking about lately. It has to do with the lady who had octuplets recently.
Yes.
So she has 14 children, and some people have talked about whether taxpayers and so on, should have to support her children. And I'm thinking there are three options to take with regard to cases like that. You could say up front that any children that are had in circumstances like that will be paid for by taxpayers, or you could say that they won't be paid for, or you could say we'll try to have reproductive restrictions. And none of those seem acceptable because reproductive restrictions are an invasion of privacy rights. Saying that you'll pay for the children with taxpayer money encourages the behavior, like you were mentioning, and saying that you won't pay for them is not fair to the children. So it's a dilemma because I'm not sure I'm seeing what the best option would be, although my first inclination would be to say that you will just have to pay for them. And that's just the way it is. But I'm not sure if you have any more to say about that. Thanks.
Well, let me say first of all that I have not, believe it or not, I may be the only one in this country who has not followed this case in excruciating detail. I'll give you I may be factually wrong. You tell me as we're going along. Is it not the case that this woman has 14 children largely as the result of the use of in vitro fertilization? Are all of those children the result of that? I think there is a legitimate reason to prevent, by law, in vitro fertilization. Why? Because it instrumentalizes all of the embryos who have been produced for the sake of this. Now, I have great sympathy for families who have not been able to have children naturally on their own and their attempts at this. But I think that in vitro fertilization, to begin with, disregards the dignity of the human person. Because what in vitro fertilization does is it calls for the production of excessive embryos and then implants them outside of the conjugal union. Let's leave that question aside, just the manufacturing of these children. So I think that a woman who has a Angelina Jolie wannabe gene in her cannot be permitted by law, should not be permitted by law, to do this. But let's say she had all of these 14 children naturally. She'd be a much older woman because she couldn't have just done it, so quickly. I think this would inhibit that kind of activity. I think, moreover, that ultimately I have no doubt that people would stand up and want to adopt those children without government regulation. I have no doubt that people would want to. And I think depending on this woman's mental capacity, again, I don't know a lot, but I just have a feeling pastorally from having dealt with a lot of different kind of people, that if you look under the roof of that car, you're going to find a lot of very, very dangerous and dysfunctional things that would legitimate the permission of having other people adopt and take care of those children. I think the problem, if you have the state do it, you're going to have more and more of this kind of thing. Now, I recognize that what I'm saying is highly controversial. I was against removing caps on welfare mothers. The policy had been, I'm not even sure where it is now, I was against removing the caps so that women could continue to have more and more children and receive an increase in their benefits. When I met Cardinal O'Connor he said, well, I've read your writings. He said, and I agree with almost everything you've written, but not that. My reason for it is I think that families don't get that kind of benefit. You go into your boss and say, well, you know, I had 3 more kids, and can I get a raise? No, it's your economic out. Of course, somebody could argue, well, they should, and that's a separate argument. So I think what you're doing is incentivizing people to live irresponsibly. If they're going to have children, they need to be responsible for the care and the upbringing of these children. So I would not have the state do that. In a most emergency situation, if these kids had no one to take care of them, if she had no resources to fall back upon, then I would say yes. But I think this is a far cry from that. People would line up around the block to help take care of those kids under certain conditions. And I think the state has every reason to demand that those similar conditions be met. I'm not sure whether the in vitro fertilization itself was subsidized by the state or not. That I don't know. So that would be another thing. I don't think in vitro fertilization should be legal, and I don't think it should be subsidized. And I don't think a person like that, if you got to know her very well, is really fit to be the mother of these children. And saying that, I think this woman needs a lot of love, and she's just going about it the wrong way.
I was going to ask you about the president's stimulus bill, and the two very, but I tell you, I really, having listened to your the way you reason things out, I wanted to ask you about the churches turning into businesses and becoming really welfare beneficiaries because they're not taxed. They grab up all these properties, these real estate properties, and they become non-taxable, and property owners out here are having to pay those taxes to make up for that.
Well, let me answer both those questions.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm so happy.
Not only do I think that the church should be tax exempt, I think you should be tax exempt. You know, in other words, I think that the burden of taxation becomes acute because there's so much that the government's undertaken to do. And so I don't think that, and I don't know about Texas law, but in Michigan, where I live, and other states in the nation, it is not the case that the church, when it owns property that it uses for profit making, is tax exempt, so that a religious press who produces books and makes a profit on those books has to pay some tax on those books. I think that if the church would get back into the business of doing, by the church here I mean the Christian community in general, because this is an ecumenical problem that I'm identifying that came to a head through the faith-based initiatives. I came to Austin some 8.5 years ago to meet with the then Governor Bush, who was talking about, well, he was actually the President-elect Bush, talking about these faith-based initiatives. And I saw before my eyes this whole thing morph into a political incentive program so that religious charities were going to be given government money. I think that's a far more problematic thing than tax exemption. I think as long as churches are using churches for the function of the church for religious worship and for the social services that the church provides, that it should be tax exempt, because I don't think that the money belongs to the government in the first place. I think it belongs to the taxpayers, and that the church offers this function. I think in agreement with that, I think there are better ways. I think there should be lower taxation. And I think a greater burden for the care of the poor should be put on the church for this. With regard to the stimulus package, there's so much to say about this. So let me just say 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things about it. The first is, please note how everybody who is addressing this, says something to the effect that we don't know what happened, and we don't know if it's going to work, and we don't know, and we don't know. How many times have you heard the phrase, we don't know, or it's very complex, or some variation of that? And they are absolutely right. None of them know what's going on. And if you don't know what's going on, you don't throw $2 trillion at it and hope that it's going to, which is exactly what the president said in his press conference. I don't know that this is going to work. You'll hold me accountable for it. Well, I hope we will. And I don't know how long it's going to take, because that's a lot of money. That can create a lot of illusion. But my fear is that once this goes through, you're going to have this jump because it's going out there. Then what you're going to have is a crash and then inflation, and a mean inflation. So that's one of the things. And the reason we don't know is because we have distorted the markets. If we had back in October, November, left it to play itself out. Remember all of the urgent calls, we have to do this weekend. We have to do it this weekend. If we don't, everything is going to go to hell in a handbasket. And they did it, and it all went to hell in the handbasket. The next day, you remember what the markets did. If we had done nothing, and by the way, they haven't even spent the whole amount that they allocated. So you saw that it really wasn't as urgent. You know, when Sarkozy in France, and when, I forget the name of the guy in Australia, is doing the same thing, and they're doing it with the same urgency, and they don't want to debate, this is too important to debate, something's not right. That we can't think about this and plan this thing and look about and debate about it. I think that what is happening, and the biggest myth is that this was all created by a market economy. This was not created. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were not phenomenon of a market economy. These were governmental, bureaucratic interventions that kind of built upon themselves and metastasized and incentivized people to buy houses they couldn't afford, not bad people, and incentivized banks to lend without using the prudent risk that a rigorous market mechanism would have demanded that they do. So all of this is happening now, and it is breathtaking. You know, it's like Jerome said when he, in the 4th century, he said, I woke up one day, the whole world groaned to find itself Arian, when the Arian heresy had permeated all of the bishops of the church. And I felt that way, like I woke up one morning to find the whole world Keynesian, or to find the whole world socialist. You know, the only hope is that there is an Athanasius waiting in the wings to come and combat the Arian heresy and put people aright to lead us on the way to, I'm using obvious excessive language here, on the way to economic orthodoxy, not Christological orthodoxy. So that's my 4 takes on that, and there's so much more I could say about that, but this is insane. It's insane. Buy gold. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Sirico.